Thomas Lawson stared at the man who stole 15 years. Mr. Sterling's laughter echoed through the Charleston street, a sound that carved fresh wounds into old scars. 24 hours. That was all Thomas had before his parole officer would drag him back into the cage. The weapon was hidden somewhere in that perfect house, behind that perfect smile. Thomas had learned many things in prison, and tonight he would use every single one of them, subscribe to witness a man's final gamble with truth. Thomas Lawson stood at the corner of Meeting Street, watching the evening light bleed gold across the historic buildings of Charleston, his hands trembling not from cold, but from the weight of what he had just discovered. 15 years had passed since the night they dragged him from his apartment, since the jury foreman read the word guilty with all the finality of a gravestone being carved, since the judge sentenced him to rot behind bars for a crime he never committed. The city had changed in his absence. New restaurants lined the cobblestone streets. Tourists laughed and photographed wrought iron gates he used to pass every morning on his way to work. But the ache inside him remained unchanged, a wound that never healed because it was never acknowledged. He had walked out of Lee Correctional Institution 3 months ago with nothing but a plastic bag containing his belongings and a parole officer's business card. And he had tried, God knows he had tried, to rebuild something from the ashes of his former life. But tonight, standing in the fading light with his heart hammering against his ribs, Thomas knew that freedom without vindication was just another kind of prison. The face he had seen across the street 20 minutes earlier belonged to Mr. Sterling, the man whose testimony had sealed Thomas's fate, the man who had stood in that courtroom with tears streaming down his face as he pointed at Thomas and called him a monster. Sterling had aged well. His silver hair was professionally styled. His tan suit probably cost more than Thomas made in 6 months at the warehouse job he'd managed to find. And his smile as he chatted with a well-dressed woman outside a boutique gallery was the smile of a man who slept peacefully at night. Thomas had followed him for 3 blocks before the realization crystallized into something harder than rage, sharper than hatred, the absolute certainty that Sterling was not a witness but the architect of Thomas's destruction. The way Sterling moved through the world, the ease of his gestures, the practiced charm he deployed like a weapon, it was all wrong, all performance, and Thomas's 15 years of watching men lie and pretend and hide behind masks had given him an education no university could provide. He pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking fingers, checking the time with a growing sense of doom settling in his chest like cement. 7:45 in the evening. He had until 9 o'clock to be back at the halfway house on the north side of the city, a full 40-minute bus ride if traffic cooperated, which it rarely did. His parole officer, a woman named Patricia Hendricks, with eyes like a hawk and the disposition of someone who had stopped believing in second chances long ago, had made it abundantly clear during their last meeting that any violation, no matter how small, would send him straight back to prison. Thomas had nodded, had promised, had swallowed his pride and his anger, because what choice did he have? But that was before he saw Sterling, before the past 15 years crystallized into this single burning moment. If he missed curfew, if Patricia filed her report, he would be back in a cell by morning, and Sterling would continue his perfect life untouched, unpunished, free. The street around him pulsed with the casual rhythms of people whose lives had never been interrupted by steel doors and strip searches, by the constant threat of violence or the slow erosion of hope that came from being forgotten by the world. A couple walked past holding hands, their laughter bright and careless, and Thomas felt the distance between their reality and his like a physical barrier he could never cross. He had spent 15 years learning to read men's intentions in the twitch of a jaw or the shift of eyes, had learned which guards could be reasoned with and which ones fed on cruelty, had learned to make himself small and quiet and invisible because visibility meant danger. But he had also learned other things. How to pick locks with nothing but a bent piece of metal, how to move through shadows without making a sound, how to read a room's layout and identify its weaknesses. The prison had tried to break him, but instead it had forged him into something harder, something capable of doing what needed to be done. Sterling had disappeared into a townhouse 3 blocks away, a beautifully restored building with gas lanterns flanking a glossy black door and window boxes overflowing with carefully maintained flowers. Thomas had watched from across the street as Sterling climbed the steps with the casual confidence of ownership, had seen the warm light flood the foyer as the door opened, had glimpsed expensive furnishings and artwork through the front windows before the curtains were drawn. The house was a statement, a monument to success and respectability, and Thomas knew with bone-deep certainty that somewhere inside those walls was the evidence he needed, the weapon that had actually committed the crime, the proof that would unravel Sterling's perfect lie. He had 24 hours before his parole violation became official, before the system that had already stolen 15 years would swallow him whole again. 24 hours to break into that house, find the weapon, and force the truth into the light. He started walking towards Sterling's townhouse, his steps measured and deliberate, despite the chaos screaming through his mind, trying to calculate angles and risks and possibilities. The street was lined with similar buildings, their historic facades glowing softly in the dusk, and he counted security cameras mounted on corners and doorways, noted which houses had lights burning in upper floors and which sat dark. His hands were steady now, the trembling replaced by something colder, more focused, the kind of clarity that comes when a man realizes he has nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Thomas had been dead for 15 years, a ghost wandering through other people's memories, and tonight he would either reclaim his life or lose it entirely. There was a strange freedom in that certainty, a liberation that came from finally having a clear purpose after years of directionless survival. He pulled his jacket tighter against the evening chill and continued walking, his mind already mapping the approach to Sterling's perfect house, already planning the breaking of locks and the searching of rooms, already preparing for the confrontation that would decide whether justice was still possible in a world that had forgotten him. Thomas circled the block 3 times before settling into a recessed doorway across the street from Sterling's townhouse, his body pressed against the cold brick as the evening deepened into night around him. The neighborhood was quiet now, the earlier foot traffic thinning to occasional couples returning from dinner or residents walking small dogs that yapped at shadows. He watched the windows of Sterling's home, tracking the movement of light behind curtains, counting the rooms that illuminated and darkened as Sterling moved through his evening routine. The second floor glowed warm and steady, suggesting a bedroom or study, while the ground floor flickered with the blue wash of a television, and Thomas memorized these patterns the way he had once memorized guard rotations and cell block schedules, the way survival had taught him to track the rhythms of danger. His watch read 8:15, and each minute that passed carved away at his dwindling freedom, but he forced himself to remain still, to wait, to plan, rather than simply react. The 15 years he had lost stretched behind him like a chasm he could never cross, a gulf filled with moments he would never reclaim. Birthdays and holidays, the funerals of both his parents, the slow dissolution of every friendship and relationship he had built before his arrest. His sister had visited him exactly twice in those 15 years, and both times she had looked at him with something worse than anger, pity mixed with uncertainty, as if she couldn't quite decide whether the jury had been wrong or whether Thomas had simply been good at hiding his true nature. The second visit had been the last, and he had watched her walk away through the reinforced glass of the visiting room, knowing he would never see her again. knowing that the man she remembered as her brother had been erased by the weight of that single word, guilty. He had written letters for the first 3 years, pouring his innocence and his anguish onto page after page that went unanswered, until finally he stopped, until he accepted that the world had already buried him and moved on. Sterling's laughter from earlier still echoed in Thomas's memory, the sound of it casual and unguarded, the laughter of a man who had never known real consequence. Thomas had confronted him an hour after first spotting him, had followed Sterling into a parking garage and called his name, had watched the older man turn with that practiced smile still in place. The smile had faltered only slightly when Sterling recognized Thomas, a brief flicker of something, surprise, calculation, maybe even fear, before the mask settled back into place. Thomas had said simply, "I know it was you." And Sterling had laughed, the sound bouncing off concrete walls, before replying with chilling confidence, "Prove it, Thomas. You've got no proof, no evidence, nothing but the desperate fantasy of a convicted felon. I have a life, a reputation, and you have nothing." Then Sterling had walked away, his footsteps echoing through the garage, leaving Thomas standing alone with the certainty burning through him like acid. The blue flicker of Sterling's television suddenly went dark, and Thomas tensed in his doorway, watching as the ground floor of the townhouse fell into shadow. A moment later, the second-floor lights brightened, and Thomas could make out Sterling's silhouette moving past a window. The man was heading to bed, settling into his evening routine with the same comfortable predictability that marked everything about his performance of respectability. Thomas waited another 20 minutes, watching for any sign of movement, any indication that Sterling might come back downstairs or that there were others in the house with him. The research Thomas had done, sitting in a public library computer lab, hunched over a screen while trying not to look like the ex-convict he was, had confirmed that Sterling lived alone, that he was unmarried, that he owned a small consulting firm that somehow generated enough income to support this house and the expensive car parked outside. Everything about Sterling's life was carefully constructed, a facade of success that depended on no one looking too closely at the foundation. Thomas's knees ached from crouching in the doorway, and his back carried the permanent stiffness that came from sleeping on prison mattresses that might as well have been concrete. He was 52 years old, but he felt ancient, worn down by years of hypervigilance and the constant low-grade stress of knowing that any moment could explode into violence. The warehouse where he worked, loading trucks, paid minimum wage, and his parole terms required that 70% of his earnings go toward restitution for a crime he didn't commit, money that would supposedly go to the victim's family, though Thomas knew the real victim was him. His room at the halfway house was barely larger than his old cell, and the men he lived alongside were a mix of genuine repenters and career criminals biding their time until their next mistake. He had tried to build something from nothing, had tried to accept that this diminished life was all he would ever have, but seeing Sterling had shattered that fragile acceptance completely. He checked his watch again, 8:45, and made his decision with the finality of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. If he left now, took the bus back to the halfway house, made curfew with minutes to spare, he would wake up tomorrow still trapped in this half-life, still carrying the weight of a crime he never committed while his real destroyer slept peacefully. But if he stayed, if he broke into Sterling's house and found the weapon, the gun that had actually been used in the shooting, the piece of evidence that would prove Sterling had been at the scene, not Thomas, then maybe, just maybe, he could force the truth into existence. The risk was absolute. If he was caught breaking into Sterling's home, the parole violation would be compounded by new criminal charges, and he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the alternative was suffocation, a slow death by inches, the gradual erosion of his soul as he accepted an injustice too enormous to survive. Thomas took a deep breath, tasting the salt air that drifted up from the harbour, and stepped out of the doorway, crossing the street towards Sterling's perfect house with the steady determination of a man who had finally found his purpose. Thomas approached Sterling's townhouse from the narrow alley that ran behind the building, his footsteps careful and measured on the uneven brick pavement that generations of feet had worn smooth. The alley smelled of kitchen grease and garbage that waited in ornate bins for morning collection, and the sodium glow of a distant streetlight barely penetrated this service corridor where Charleston's historic beauty gave way to practical necessity. He counted buildings as he moved, matching addresses to the mental map he had constructed during his surveillance, until he stood before a tall wooden gate, painted glossy black and secured with a simple latch. The gate opened without sound, well-maintained hinges swinging smoothly, and Thomas slipped into a small courtyard garden that glowed silver in the moonlight. Brick pavers arranged in herringbone patterns, a small fountain gurgling softly in the corner, herbs growing in terracotta pots that lined the walls. It was beautiful in the way money made things beautiful, carefully designed to appear effortless while requiring constant maintenance and attention. The back of Sterling's townhouse rose 3 stories above the courtyard, windows dark except for one on the second floor, where soft light leaked around heavy curtains. Thomas studied the building's architecture with the methodical attention he had learned from a fellow inmate named Marcus, a career burglar who had spent their shared years in prison teaching Thomas the craft of entry and evasion. Marcus had died in a prison yard confrontation 2 years before Thomas's release, but his lessons remained. Always check for security systems first, look for cameras mounted near entrances, identify the weak points where old buildings met modern conveniences. Thomas spotted a security panel mounted near the back door, its LED glowing green, and he felt his stomach tighten because green meant unarmed, meant Sterling felt secure enough in his perfect life that he didn't bother setting his alarm. The arrogance of that simple green light filled Thomas with cold fury. He moved to the back door, a modern installation of steel and glass that contrasted with the building's historic exterior, and examined the lock with fingers that remembered Marcus's patient instruction. The lock was good, but not exceptional. A standard residential deadbolt that relied more on the illusion of security than actual resistance to someone who knew what they were doing. Thomas pulled from his pocket a small leather case he had assembled over the past months. Tension wrenches and picks salvaged from various sources, tools that Marcus had taught him to fashion from ordinary objects. His hands were steady as he selected a pick, inserting it into the lock's keyway while applying gentle pressure with the tension wrench, feeling for the tiny movements of pins settling into place. The world narrowed to the tactile feedback traveling through the metal into his fingertips, each pin a small puzzle that yielded with patient manipulation. And Thomas worked in silence, broken only by his own breathing and the distant sound of traffic on Meeting Street. The lock surrendered after 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours, the deadbolt sliding back with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet courtyard. Thomas paused, listening for any response from inside the house. Footsteps, voices, the sound of Sterling coming to investigate, but there was nothing except the fountain's gentle burble and the thud of his own pulse in his ears. He turned the door handle and pushed, feeling resistance give way, and stepped into Sterling's kitchen with the slow deliberation of someone crossing a border from which there would be no return. The kitchen was immaculate, all granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that gleamed even in the darkness, and Thomas closed the door behind him with exquisite care, his eyes adjusting to the deeper shadows of the interior. He stood completely still for a full minute, letting his senses expand to fill the space around him, cataloguing every detail the way prison had taught him to read environments for threat and opportunity. The kitchen opened into a dining area, and beyond that he could see the edge of a living room where the television he had watched from outside sat dark and silent. The house carried the smell of money, furniture polish, and expensive candles, the faint chemical scent of professional cleaning services, the absence of cooking odors that suggested Sterling ate most of his meals out. Thomas moved forward, his rubber-soled shoes silent on hardwood floors that probably cost more per square foot than Thomas earned in a week, and he felt like a ghost haunting the ruins of someone else's dream. The contrast between this house and the cell he had occupied for 15 years was so extreme it bordered on obscene. Here was space and comfort and beauty, while there had been concrete and steel and the constant press of bodies and noise. The staircase rose from the center of the townhouse, its banister gleaming dark wood that had been polished to a mirror shine, and Thomas began climbing with his hand barely touching the rail, testing each step for creaks before committing his weight. The second floor held what appeared to be Sterling's bedroom. Light still glowed beneath a closed door, along with a bathroom and what might have been a home office. But Thomas's goal was higher. In the attic space that Marcus had always said was where people hid their secrets because attics required effort to access and were rarely visited. He found the attic access at the end of the second-floor hallway. A pull-down ladder folded into the ceiling, and he stared up at it while calculating risks. If Sterling heard him moving around overhead, if the ladder made noise when extended, if the attic floor creaked under his weight, any of these could end his search before it began, could send him back to prison not for 15 years, but for the rest of his life. But the certainty that had driven him here remained unshaken, a core of absolute conviction that somewhere in this house was the weapon that would prove his innocence. Thomas reached up, grasped the cord that would release the ladder, and pulled, committing himself completely to whatever came next. The attic ladder unfolded with a whisper of metal against wood, the counterweight mechanism so well maintained that it descended almost silently into the hallway below. Thomas stood frozen for 30 seconds, listening for any response from Sterling's bedroom. But the house remained still, except for the ambient sounds of old buildings settling and the distant hum of the HVAC system pushing climate-controlled air through hidden vents. He began climbing the ladder, each rung a small commitment to the path he had chosen, his muscles tense and ready to flee if the door at the end of the hallway suddenly opened. The attic space exhaled warm, stale air as his head emerged through the opening, and he pulled himself up into darkness so complete it felt solid, reaching for the small flashlight he had brought from the halfway house. A cheap plastic thing he had bought at a dollar store, but which now felt as valuable as any tool he had ever held. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing an attic space that ran the entire length of the townhouse. Its ceiling peaked and crossed with exposed beams that looked original to the building's 19th century construction. But unlike the dusty, cobweb-filled attics Thomas remembered from his childhood, Sterling's attic had been partially finished. Plywood flooring covered the joists, and the space had been organized with the same meticulous care that characterized the rest of the house. Cardboard boxes sat stacked along one wall, each labeled with neat handwriting that identified their contents as Tax Documents 2019-2022 or Client Files Archive. A set of expensive golf clubs leaned in one corner next to a pair of skis that looked like they had never touched snow, and several pieces of furniture covered in drop cloths suggested storage for items that no longer fit Sterling's current aesthetic. Thomas swept the beam slowly across the space, searching for anything that seemed out of place, any container that might hold something Sterling needed to keep but couldn't risk discarding. His flashlight settled on a metal filing cabinet pushed against the far wall, nearly invisible behind a stack of boxes that had been arranged to obscure it. Thomas made his way across the attic floor, placing his feet carefully on the plywood to minimize creaks. his breathing shallow and controlled despite the heat that accumulated under the roof. The filing cabinet was old, its olive-green paint chipped and worn, completely unlike anything else in Sterling's carefully curated home, and that incongruity sent electricity through Thomas's nerves. He moved the boxes aside, revealing the cabinet fully, and tried the top drawer, only to find it locked with a simple mechanism that yielded almost immediately to one of his picks. The drawer slid open with a metallic groan that seemed catastrophically loud in the enclosed space, and Thomas froze again, listening, waiting, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his temples. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no indication that Sterling had heard anything. Thomas exhaled slowly and directed his flashlight into the open drawer, revealing a collection of files and folders that appeared to be old business records, contracts and correspondence dating back years. He rifled through them quickly, finding nothing remarkable, then moved to the second drawer, which opened more smoothly. This one contained personal documents, an expired passport, Sterling's birth certificate, old tax returns that predated the digital archives downstairs. Thomas was reaching for the third drawer when his flashlight beam caught something pushed to the very back of the second drawer, wrapped in a dark cloth that was probably an old t-shirt. His hands were shaking again as he reached for it, pulling the bundle free, feeling the weight and shape of it even before he unwrapped the fabric. The gun was there, cold and solid in his hands, a 9mm semi-automatic pistol that matched exactly the description from his trial, the weapon that had been used in the shooting that sent Thomas to prison. He sat back on his heels, staring at the gun in the beam of his flashlight, feeling 15 years of anguish and rage crystallize into this single object. The prosecution had never found the actual murder weapon. They had convicted Thomas based on circumstantial evidence and Sterling's testimony that he had seen Thomas fleeing the scene. But here it was, hidden in Sterling's attic, like a secret too dangerous to destroy, but too valuable to throw away. Thomas's hands trembled as he held the gun, and for a moment he imagined using it. Imagined walking down those stairs and confronting Sterling with the weapon that proved everything. But that path led only to more prison, more years stolen, and he forced the thought away. He rewrapped the gun carefully in the cloth, noting that the fabric was actually an old t-shirt with a faded logo he didn't recognize, and he placed it beside him while he continued searching the drawer. Beneath where the gun had been hidden, he found a manila envelope that contained photographs, old prints on glossy paper that had begun to curl with age. Thomas spread them out on the attic floor, his flashlight beam moving from image to image, and his blood went cold. The photographs showed the night of the crime, the alley behind the convenience store where the shooting had occurred, and in one image, Thomas could clearly see Sterling's car, a distinctive vintage Mercedes that Sterling had owned back then, parked near the scene. Thomas had never known Sterling had been there that night, had never understood why Sterling would claim to have witnessed Thomas fleeing when Thomas had been 3 miles away at a friend's apartment. But these photographs suggested something far worse than misidentification. They suggested Sterling had been the shooter, that he had framed Thomas deliberately, that the entire prosecution had been built on the testimony of the actual murderer. Thomas gathered the photographs and the wrapped gun, his mind racing through possibilities and plans. He needed to get out of this house, needed to get this evidence to the police before Sterling discovered the break-in, needed to move quickly because his parole officer would already be noting his absence and preparing paperwork. He was stuffing the photographs back into the envelope when he heard it. A sound from below, the unmistakable creak of a door opening, followed by footsteps on the stairs. Sterling was awake, was moving through the house, and Thomas was trapped in the attic with nowhere to run. His flashlight beam wavered as panic seized his chest, and he quickly switched off the light, plunging himself into absolute darkness while the footsteps grew louder, coming up the stairs, heading directly toward where the attic ladder hung down into the hallway. Thomas pressed himself against the filing cabinet, the gun and photographs clutched to his chest, and waited in the darkness for whatever would happen next. Thomas held his breath in the suffocating darkness of the attic, listening as Sterling's footsteps reached the second floor and paused, and he could hear through the floor the sound of the man muttering to himself in sleepy confusion. The footsteps moved toward the bathroom, and Thomas heard water running, the mundane sound of a man who had simply woken in the night to use the toilet. Relief flooded through him so intensely he felt dizzy, but he remained frozen against the filing cabinet, the gun and photographs pressed against his chest like sacred relics. The water stopped. Footsteps returned down the hallway, and Thomas tracked their progress back toward the bedroom, waiting for the sound of a door closing that would signal Sterling's return to sleep. But the footsteps stopped moving, and Thomas realized with growing horror that Sterling had noticed the attic ladder hanging down, realized that something was wrong in his perfect house. The silence that followed was worse than any sound, a suspension of time, while Sterling processed the impossibility of the ladder being down when he hadn't pulled it. Thomas could imagine the man standing in the hallway, staring up at the dark opening in the ceiling, his mind working through explanations and settling inevitably on the truth. Then Sterling's voice cut through the silence, loud and sharp with anger that barely masked fear underneath. "I know you're up there, Thomas. I know it's you. Do you really think this is going to end well for you?" The voice carried a tremor that suggested Sterling wasn't as confident as his words pretended, and Thomas felt a savage satisfaction beneath his terror. He remained silent, hoping against hope that Sterling might convince himself he was imagining things, might retreat back to bed and give Thomas time to escape. But Sterling's footsteps came forward instead, approaching the ladder with the slow deliberation of someone trying to project authority while actually terrified. Thomas could hear Sterling breathing hard as he began climbing the ladder, could hear the metal rungs protesting under his weight, and Thomas knew that his moment of decision had arrived. He could try to hide in the dark attic, hope Sterling didn't have a flashlight, hope he could slip past the man and escape, or he could confront Sterling here, now, with the evidence literally in his hands. His fingers tightened around the cloth-wrapped gun, and he moved away from the filing cabinet, positioning himself near the attic opening where Sterling's head would emerge. The flashlight in his other hand felt slick in his palm, and he thumbed it on just as Sterling's silver hair appeared through the opening, flooding the man's face with sudden white light. Sterling recoiled from the beam, nearly losing his grip on the ladder, and Thomas saw pure fear flash across the older man's features before anger rushed in to replace it. Sterling's eyes adjusted to the light, focusing on Thomas standing above him, and his expression transformed through a rapid series of calculations. Shock, recognition, then settling into a kind of weary resignation that was almost worse than anger. "You stupid, stupid man," Sterling said, his voice dropping to something almost conversational. "You actually broke into my house. You violated your parole. Do you understand what you've done? I don't even need to prove anything now. You've destroyed yourself." He pulled himself fully into the attic, rising to his feet with effort, and Thomas backed up several steps, maintaining distance between them while keeping the flashlight trained on Sterling's face. Thomas found his voice, and it came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by 15 years of anger he had been forced to swallow. "I found the gun, Sterling. The actual weapon from the shooting. The one you hid up here because you couldn't bring yourself to throw it away. And I found the photographs. Your car at the scene, proof you were there that night." He pulled the wrapped bundle from under his arm, letting the cloth fall away so Sterling could see the gun clearly. It's over. Whatever you thought you could protect by framing me, whatever perfect life you built on my destroyed one, it ends tonight." Thomas's hand shook as he held the gun, not pointing it at Sterling but holding it between them like evidence at a trial, like the physical manifestation of truth that had been buried for 15 years. Sterling's face went through another transformation, color draining until he looked grey in the flashlight beam, and his voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper. "You don't understand what you're holding, Thomas. You don't understand what that represents or why I kept it. If you take that to the police, you won't just destroy me. You'll destroy everything." Thomas felt a flicker of confusion beneath his certainty because Sterling's reaction wasn't what he expected. There was no defiance, no threats, just something that looked almost like resignation mixed with genuine fear. Sterling moved slowly to sit on one of the drop-cloth-covered pieces of furniture, his movements those of an old man whose carefully maintained facade had finally cracked. "I'll tell you the truth," Sterling said, his voice hollow. "I'll tell you everything, and then you can decide what to do, but you need to understand the person who actually pulled that trigger, who actually committed that crime 15 years ago. It wasn't me either." Thomas stood frozen, the gun heavy in his hand, his mind struggling to process Sterling's words while every instinct screamed that this was another manipulation, another lie designed to protect the man who had stolen his life. But something in Sterling's posture, in the way his shoulders slumped and his carefully maintained mask finally slipped, suggested that the truth might be even more complicated than Thomas had imagined. The attic air felt suffocating, hot and close, and Thomas could feel sweat running down his spine, despite the relative coolness of the November night outside. His watch read 9:35. He had missed his curfew, had violated his parole, had broken into Sterling's home and found evidence that might vindicate him or might simply be another trap. And now Sterling sat before him, claiming innocence, claiming knowledge of the real truth, offering to explain everything in this dark attic while the city of Charleston slept below them, unaware that two men's fates were being decided in the shadows above. Sterling's hands shook as he reached into his pocket, and Thomas tensed, gripping the gun tighter until Sterling slowly withdrew nothing more threatening than a worn leather wallet, holding it up so Thomas could see before opening it with deliberate movements. From inside, Sterling pulled a photograph that he held out toward Thomas, his arm extending into the flashlight beam while his face remained in partial shadow. Thomas approached carefully, maintaining distance, and took the photograph while keeping his eyes on Sterling, then glanced down at the image caught in the flashlight's glow. The photograph showed a young man in his 20s, dark-haired and smiling with the easy confidence of someone who had never known real hardship, and Thomas recognized the features even though he had never seen this person before. The resemblance to Sterling was unmistakable, the same bone structure and eyes, clearly a son or younger relative. Sterling's voice cracked as he spoke, the careful veneer of his professional persona completely stripped away to reveal something raw and broken underneath. His name was David. My son. He was 23 years old and he was struggling. Substance issues, mental health problems. I didn't fully understand until it was too late. That night, the night of the shooting, David called me in a panic saying he'd done something terrible, that he needed help, that he was scared. Sterling's words came faster now, spilling out as if a dam had finally broken, and Thomas watched the older man's face contort with anguish that looked genuine even through the shadows. I drove to that convenience store and found him there, found him with the gun still in his hand and that poor clerk lying on the ground. David was sobbing, saying it was an accident, that he'd only meant to scare the clerk into giving him money for his habit. Thomas felt his certainty wavering, the clear lines of guilt and innocence that had seemed so absolute beginning to blur in ways that made him nauseous. Sterling continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper as he stared at the photograph now lying on the floor between them. I made a choice that night, the worst choice of my life. I took the gun from David, I told him to run, and I stayed to create a story that would protect him. I saw you leaving your friend's apartment complex when I drove away from the scene, saw you walking to your car, and something desperate in my mind decided you could be the answer. I gave the police your description, testified that I'd seen you fleeing the scene, and I told myself I was saving my son's life. Sterling looked up at Thomas, and the tears streaming down his face caught the flashlight beam, and Thomas felt his own eyes burning because the story was too specific, too painful to be entirely fabricated. But the anger that had sustained Thomas for 15 years wasn't so easily extinguished, and he heard his voice rise with fury that made his throat ache. So you sacrificed me. You let an innocent man go to prison for 15 years. Let me lose everything, my family, my career, my entire life, because you wanted to protect your son from the consequences of his actions. Do you have any idea what those years did to me? Do you have any idea what it's like to wake up every single day knowing you're innocent, but having the entire world treat you like you're guilty? Thomas's hands trembled violently now, the gun feeling impossibly heavy, and part of him wanted to use it, wanted to make Sterling feel even a fraction of the suffering Thomas had endured. But another part of him, the part that had survived prison by holding on to his humanity, even when everything around him tried to strip it away, held back. Sterling nodded slowly, not defending himself, not making excuses, just accepting Thomas's rage like it was something he had been expecting for 15 years. You're right. Everything you're saying is right. I destroyed your life to save my son, and there's no justification for that. No explanation that makes it acceptable. I've lived with that knowledge every single day since then, watching you disappear into the system while I maintained this perfect facade. Sterling gestured around the attic, then down toward the house below, his movement encompassing the entire false life he had built. David died 3 years after the shooting, an overdose in a motel room 2 states away. He couldn't live with what he'd done, couldn't survive the guilt, even though I'd tried to protect him from facing it. So I kept the gun, kept these photographs, kept all the evidence, because throwing it away felt like erasing him completely. And I've been waiting, Thomas. Part of me has been waiting for this exact moment, for someone to finally uncover the truth. Thomas felt the strength draining from his legs, and he slowly lowered himself to sit on the plywood floor, the gun resting in his lap while his mind tried to process the layers of tragedy Sterling had just revealed. If Sterling was telling the truth, and the anguish in the man's voice suggested he was, then Thomas's 15 years had been stolen not by a calculating monster, but by a desperate father trying to save a doomed son. It didn't make the injustice any less devastating, didn't give Thomas back the years he had lost, but it complicated the clean narrative of revenge he had been carrying. He thought about his own parents, both dead now, and wondered what they might have done in Sterling's position, wondered if love could drive anyone to commit unforgivable acts. The question sat in his chest like a stone, and he found he couldn't answer it, even though he wanted to believe he would have chosen differently. Sterling was watching him, waiting, and when Thomas finally looked up, the older man spoke again with the quiet intensity of someone making a final confession. I'll go with you to the police right now. I'll give them a full statement. I'll testify to everything. I'll take whatever punishment comes. You'll be exonerated. Your record will be cleared, and I'll spend whatever years I have left in prison where I probably should have been all along. But Thomas, I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we bring this evidence forward tonight, you'll be violating your parole by being here. They might hold that against you even after the truth comes out, might make your exoneration more complicated. We need to do this carefully, need to contact a lawyer first, need to build the case properly so that you're protected. Thomas heard the logic in Sterling's words, heard the careful reasoning that suggested Sterling still had some instinct for self-preservation operating beneath his apparent surrender. But he also heard something else. Genuine concern for what might happen to Thomas, genuine desire to make sure the truth actually set Thomas free instead of entangling him in new complications. Thomas looked down at the gun in his lap, at the photographs scattered around him, at the evidence that could finally prove his innocence after 15 years of being invisible to justice. His watch read 9:58. He had been off parole grounds for nearly 3 hours, had broken multiple laws to get to this moment, and the consequences of those choices were already in motion. But he had also found what he came for, had discovered proof that would vindicate him. And sitting in this hot attic with the man who had destroyed his life, Thomas felt something unexpected rising through his anger and pain. Not forgiveness. He wasn't capable of that yet, maybe would never be capable of it, but something like understanding. A recognition that human beings could commit terrible wrongs out of love as easily as out of malice, and that truth was rarely as simple as he wanted it to be. He stood slowly, his knees protesting, and looked at Sterling with eyes that burned from sweat and unshed tears. "We're going to the police," Thomas said quietly. "Right now. You're going to tell them everything. And I'm going to give them this evidence, and whatever happens to me after that happens. But this ends tonight, Sterling. The lies end tonight." They descended from the attic in silence, Sterling first on the ladder with Thomas following behind, the gun and photographs secured in Thomas's jacket pockets where they pressed against his ribs like accusations made solid. The house around them felt different now. No longer a monument to stolen success, but instead a mausoleum of secrets and grief, every carefully chosen piece of furniture and art suddenly hollow. Sterling moved through his home, turning on lights as he went, illuminating the spaces Thomas had crept through in darkness. And in the bright exposure of overhead fixtures, the contrast between their lives became even more stark. Sterling, in his expensive pajamas and leather slippers, moving through rooms that cost more than Thomas would earn in 5 years, while Thomas stood in his second-hand jacket and worn work boots, every thread of his clothing marking him as someone the world had discarded. Sterling retrieved his cell phone from the kitchen counter and held it for a moment, staring at the screen as if the device might somehow provide an escape from what came next. Thomas watched the older man's face cycle through emotions, fear, resignation, something that might have been relief, before Sterling finally dialed with trembling fingers. The call connected, and Sterling identified himself to whoever answered at the Charleston Police Department, his voice steady despite the tears still visible on his face. "My name is Richard Sterling. I need to report information about a crime that occurred 15 years ago, a shooting death at a convenience store on Rutledge Avenue. I have evidence, and I have someone here who was wrongly convicted. We're coming to the station now." He listened to the response, gave his address, and ended the call with a finality that seemed to age him another decade. They stood in Sterling's kitchen waiting for the police to arrive, neither man speaking, the silence between them heavy with 15 years of unspoken anguish and the impossibility of reconciliation. Thomas leaned against the granite counter, exhausted in ways that went far beyond physical fatigue, and he thought about the trajectory that had brought him to this moment. The night of his arrest, when they had kicked in his apartment door at 3 a.m. The trial, where he had watched his public defender go through the motions without really fighting. The day the jury foreman read the verdict, and Thomas felt his entire future collapse into a single word. He thought about the first night in prison, when he had curled on a thin mattress listening to the sounds of men coughing and shouting and weeping, and he had promised himself he would survive, would endure, would somehow find a way back to the truth. 15 years it had taken, 15 years of survival and patience, and the slow accumulation of skills he never wanted to learn. And now he stood in this kitchen with the evidence that would finally prove his innocence. Sterling broke the silence, his voice rough and exhausted. "I know you can't forgive me. I know there's nothing I can say that will give you back what I took. But I want you to know that every comfortable moment I've had in this house, every success I've achieved in my business, every smile I've forced for clients and colleagues, all of it has been poisoned by what I did to you. I'm not asking for sympathy, just want you to know that the perfect life you thought I was living was actually a prison too, just a different kind." Thomas looked at Sterling and felt the anger that had sustained him begin to transform into something more complex, something that included recognition of shared suffering, even though their circumstances could not be compared. Sterling had slept in a comfortable bed while Thomas fought off attackers in a cell, had eaten at fine restaurants while Thomas consumed prison food that barely qualified as nutrition, but both men had been trapped by the lies Sterling created that night. The sound of cars pulling up outside broke through Thomas's thoughts, and through the front windows he could see the flash of blue lights painting the historic buildings with harsh emergency colors. Sterling moved toward the door, but Thomas stopped him with a hand on his arm, holding the older man's gaze for a long moment. "I need you to understand something," Thomas said quietly. "What you did destroyed me, took everything I had, and left me with nothing but the ability to survive. Your son's death doesn't erase that, doesn't balance any cosmic scale, but I need to believe that truth still matters, that justice is still possible, even when it's delayed by 15 years. So we're going to walk out there together, we're going to tell them everything, and we're going to trust that the system that failed me once might actually work this time." Sterling nodded, fresh tears streaming down his face, and Thomas released his arm. They opened the door together, stepping out onto the front steps of Sterling's townhouse to face 4 police officers who stood with hands near their weapons, uncertain what they were walking into. Thomas immediately raised his hands, conscious of how he must appear. A known felon standing next to a respected businessman in the middle of the night, clearly having been inside the home. The lead officer, a woman with sergeant's stripes and eyes that had seen too much human tragedy, approached cautiously while her partners maintained defensive positions. "I'm Thomas Lawson," Thomas said clearly, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "I was convicted 15 years ago for a shooting I didn't commit. This is Richard Sterling. He was the key witness at my trial. He has information about the actual crime, and I have physical evidence that will prove my innocence. We're both here voluntarily to give statements." The sergeant studied them both, her expression neutral, but Thomas could see her mind working behind her eyes, processing the situation and making rapid calculations about threat and truth. She must have recognized Sterling's name, must have seen the exhaustion and desperation in both their faces, because after a long moment, she lowered her hand from her weapon and gestured toward the police cars. "We're going to need both of you to come to the station. Mr. Lawson, I need you to understand that there's a parole violation report already filed for you. You missed your curfew by over 2 hours. I can't make that go away, but I can make sure your statement is heard. Mr. Sterling, you're coming voluntarily to give information." Sterling nodded, his voice barely audible as he said, "Yes." The sergeant looked between them once more, seeming to sense the weight of history hanging in the air between these two men, then nodded. "All right, let's go sort this out." "Oh." Thomas felt Sterling's hand on his shoulder as they walked toward the police cars, a brief touch that might have been seeking forgiveness or offering apology or simply acknowledging shared presence in this moment of reckoning. Thomas didn't pull away, didn't reject the contact, but he didn't return it either. He climbed into the back of one police car while Sterling was directed to another, and as they pulled away from the curb, Thomas looked back at Sterling's perfect townhouse, its lights blazing in every window, looking less like a home now and more like a stage set whose performance had finally ended. The weight of the gun and photographs in his jacket pressed against his ribs, evidence of truth finally brought to light. And Thomas closed his eyes against the blue flash of emergency lights, feeling 15 years of accumulated tension begin to slowly, painfully unwind. The road ahead remained uncertain. There would be statements and lawyers and bureaucratic processes that might take months or years to fully resolve. But for the first time since that terrible night when they arrested him, Thomas felt the possibility of vindication emerging from the darkness like dawn. The Charleston Police Department's interview room smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, its walls painted a color that might have been intended as calming, but instead felt oppressive under fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical persistence. Thomas sat in a metal chair that was bolted to the floor, his hands resting on a table scarred with years of interrogations and confessions, and he felt the strange symmetry of being back in a room like this. Not so different from the interrogation room where they had questioned him 15 years ago, where he had insisted on his innocence until his voice went hoarse, while detectives looked at him with expressions that said they had already decided his guilt. But this time was different. This time he had evidence. This time Sterling sat in another room down the hall, giving a statement that would finally tell the truth. The detective across from Thomas was a man in his 40s named Harrison, who had the weathered look of someone who had worked homicide cases long enough to lose faith in easy answers. He listened to Thomas's account without interruption, his expression neutral except for occasional tightening around his eyes when Thomas described the worst parts of his 15 years in prison. The gun and photographs lay bagged as evidence on the table between them, tagged and documented, and Detective Harrison had already confirmed that the gun matched the caliber and type that ballistics reports from the original case had specified. "We'll need to run tests," Harrison said, his voice carefully professional. "We'll need to verify Sterling's statement matches the physical evidence, and we'll need to review the original case files. This is going to take time, Mr. Lawson. The justice system doesn't move quickly, even when it's trying to correct its own mistakes." Thomas nodded, understanding that vindication would not arrive in a single night, no matter how much he wanted it to, that the machinery of justice that had failed him so catastrophically would now move with bureaucratic slowness to acknowledge its error. "What about the parole violation?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse from hours of talking, from telling his story again and again to different officers and detectives who cycled through the interview room. Harrison's expression softened slightly, the first crack in his professional facade. "That's complicated. Technically, you violated your parole terms by missing curfew and by breaking into Sterling's home, even if you found evidence of your innocence in the process. The district attorney's office will have to decide how to handle that, whether to pursue charges for the break-in or whether to exercise discretion given the circumstances. My personal opinion, off the record, is that any prosecutor who sends you back to prison after what's come to light tonight should be voted out of office, but I can't promise you how this will play out." The hours passed in cycles of questioning and waiting, Thomas repeating his account while Sterling did the same down the hall, their statements being cross-referenced and verified against the physical evidence and the original case files that detectives pulled from archives. Thomas learned that Sterling had been more than cooperative, had confessed everything in excruciating detail, had signed statement after statement, acknowledging his role in Thomas's wrongful conviction. The senior detective, who emerged from Sterling's interview, looked shaken, in a way that suggested even veteran investigators could still be disturbed by the capacity of ordinary people to commit extraordinary wrongs. Sterling had apparently broken down completely during his confession, had described his son, David's death in detail that left no doubt about the authenticity of his grief, and had begged them to make sure Thomas was exonerated before worrying about what charges to bring against Sterling himself. Dawn was breaking over Charleston when Detective Harrison finally returned to tell Thomas he could leave, that they had enough to begin the process of vacating his conviction, but that he would need to remain available for further questioning. "Where will you go?" Harrison asked, and Thomas realized he had no answer. The halfway house would certainly refuse to take him back, given the parole violation, and he had nowhere else, no family who would open their doors, no friends who had maintained faith through 15 years of his absence. Harrison seemed to read the confusion on Thomas's face because he made a phone call, spoke quietly with someone on the other end, then handed Thomas an address written on the back of a business card. Victim Services Advocate. She works with people who've been wrongly convicted. She'll help you find temporary housing and connect you with lawyers who specialize in exoneration cases. It's not much, but it's somewhere to start. Thomas took the card, staring at the address like it was written in a foreign language. His tired brain couldn't quite process, and he felt tears burning behind his eyes that he refused to let fall. He had survived 15 years by not crying, by keeping everything locked inside where it couldn't be used against him, and the habit was too strong to break even now, when he might finally have reason for tears of relief instead of despair. Harrison walked him out of the interview room and through the police station, past officers beginning their morning shifts who glanced at him with curiosity that Thomas ignored, until they reached the front entrance where the November dawn was painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The city was waking up around them. Delivery trucks making rounds, early commuters heading to work, the ordinary machinery of life proceeding as if the world hadn't fundamentally shifted during the night. Sterling emerged from the building behind them, escorted by 2 officers and looking like he had aged 20 years in the last 8 hours, his expensive pajamas now wrinkled and his silver hair disheveled. They had arrested him officially once his statement was complete, charging him with perjury and obstruction of justice, and he would likely spend the rest of his life in prison for crimes that included destroying Thomas's life to protect his son. The officers were leading Sterling toward a transport vehicle when he looked back, his eyes finding Thomas across the parking lot. And in that moment Thomas saw everything he needed to see: acknowledgement, anguish, the burden of a choice that had poisoned both their lives. Thomas didn't wave, didn't nod, didn't offer any gesture of forgiveness because he wasn't there yet, might never be there. But he held Sterling's gaze for a long moment before the older man was loaded into the transport, and something passed between them that wasn't forgiveness, but was perhaps the beginning of understanding. Detective Harrison drove Thomas to the address on the card, neither man speaking during the 20-minute drive through morning traffic, and Thomas watched the city pass by his window with the strange disconnection of someone who had been absent so long that everything familiar had become foreign. They pulled up in front of a modest office building, and Harrison handed Thomas another card, his own this time. "Call me if you need anything, if you have problems with the process. What happened to you was wrong, Mr. Lawson. It won't be fixed overnight, but I give you my word we're going to fix it." Thomas took the card, nodded his thanks, and climbed out of the car with movements that felt stiff and uncertain, like he was learning to navigate the world all over again. The victim services advocate turned out to be a woman named Karen, who had kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Thomas of the better social workers he had encountered during his incarceration. She listened to his abbreviated account, made phone calls while Thomas sat in her small office, drinking terrible coffee that tasted like freedom, and within 2 hours she had secured him temporary housing in a transitional facility and connected him with a lawyer who specialized in wrongful conviction cases. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Chen, reviewed the preliminary information over the phone and told Thomas with quiet confidence that she believed they could get his conviction vacated within months rather than years, that the evidence he had found combined with Sterling's confession made his case for exoneration unusually strong. Thomas listened to her outline the process, the hearings and motions and procedures that stood between him and official acknowledgement of his innocence, and for the first time in 15 years he felt something he had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. He left Karen's office in the late morning, carrying the business cards of people who would help him navigate the bureaucratic maze ahead, and he stood on the sidewalk breathing the salt-tinged air of Charleston and feeling the November sun warm on his face. Somewhere in the city, Sterling was being processed into the same prison system that had consumed 15 years of Thomas's life, and Thomas felt no satisfaction in that symmetry. No sense of justice served. What he felt instead was exhaustion so profound it went beyond physical tiredness into something existential. The bone-deep weariness of a man who had fought so long just to survive that he had almost forgotten what it meant to actually live. But beneath the exhaustion was something else, something fragile and tentative, the possibility that his name might be cleared, that the word innocent might finally be attached to him officially instead of just being something he whispered to himself in the darkness of a cell. Thomas began walking, not toward any particular destination, but simply moving through the city that had continued without him, past restaurants and shops and parks where people lived their ordinary lives, unaware that a man's entire existence had just been returned to him piece by painful piece. He thought about his parents buried in graves he'd never been able to visit, about his sister living somewhere he no longer knew how to find, about the friends and colleagues and the entire life that had evaporated the night they arrested him. He couldn't get any of that back, couldn't reclaim the years or the relationships or the person he might have been if Sterling's desperate choice hadn't consumed him. But he could move forward, could begin the slow work of building something from the wreckage, could learn to carry the weight of 15 stolen years without letting it crush him completely. The sun climbed higher in the Charleston sky, and Thomas Lawson walked through the city with evidence of his innocence finally acknowledged, his name on the slow path toward vindication, and his future uncertain but his own once again. The long road home stretched ahead of him, marked by legal proceedings and therapy sessions and the difficult work of learning to trust a world that had betrayed him so completely. But for the first time since that terrible night 15 years ago, Thomas walked as a man who had been heard, who had been believed, who had fought his way back from invisibility to truth. And though the scars would never fully heal, though the years could never be returned, he walked forward into whatever came next with his head up and his story finally told.